You're listening to Drop It Like It's Pop.
Drop it like it's pop. I'm Georgie Statius.
And I'm Vicken Karkukli. This is where two lovers of pop culture come together, unfiltered and unedited, to analyze the biggest stories, moments, and yes, controversies the world of pop has to offer, from our very special point of view as media professionals and international event experts.
I'm the PR specialist.
And I'm the journalist.
Join us as we agree to disagree and talk pop till we drop.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello.
Hello.
Where are you
Yes,
in the world today?
I was thinking about it. We're in different places this time.
We're in different places. Where are you?
Well, I'm currently in Clermont-Ferrand, France.
A name that I can never say in that beautiful French accent.
Well, you can say Clermont-Ferrand. Yeah, Clermont-Ferrand. That's right. And where are you?
I'm in Sydney. I'm at the place where we first almost met. I'm at Sydney Olympic Park.
Wonderful.
I'm
Absolutely.
overlooking Stadium Australia.
Very nice.
Where it all
Very
started.
nice.
Sydney Olympics.
So we are mixing it up this time.
We are. Tell me about this. Well, who are you? Tell me who you are first.
Well, I'm not in Louisville, Kentucky, but I'm still very much Vicken Karkukli.
Oh, and I'm not in Melbourne, but I'm still very much Georgie Statius. See,
well, that's all that matters. That's all that matters in the end. And this is still Drop It Like It's Pop.
It is Drop It Like It's Pop. And we had a little mid-season hiatus, but we're back. It feels like we've been away for weeks, but I think it was only
It's good to see you again, Georgie.
It's good to see you. And I was enjoying our playlist. So for anyone who hasn't tuned into the first 5 episodes, check us out on Instagram because we've actually released a playlist to accompany some of those first episodes that we recorded.
And I have to say, I'm loving the playlists and I'm loving putting them together. It's been a very interesting kind of added, I'm not going to say added value, but a little something extra that kind of ties in with the stuff that we discuss in the episodes.
I won't lie, I'm loving the Taylor Swift one. And I'm going to say...
Well, I'm surprised.
You go.
No, I was going to say Taylor Swift is performing in Lyon this weekend. So she's got 2 shows. So I'm currently in Clermont-Ferrand. For people who are not familiar with France, it's an hour and a half away driving distance, maybe 2 hours from my hometown of Lyon. And yes, so Taylor's going to be performing on the weekend, 2 sold out shows at the stadium in the city.
I love it. I have to say the Tortured Poets department, the more I listen to it, the more I love it. It could be my new favorite Taylor album. I'm just saying.
Silence is a virtue.
Especially, thank you, Amy. I mean, that just is pop gold. Anyway.
Are you really loving that song?
No, I don't like that song, but I am loving it. And I'm loving the set design of that element of the Eras tour. I love the costume design. I love the choreography. Champagne to everyone involved.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you're mentioning that because I don't even know what you're talking about. I haven't watched a single element of it, but I know that some songs have been added to the Eras Tour playlist from the Tortured Poets department, but that's all I know about it.
Your algorithms are obviously very different to mine.
No, yeah, I'm sure it is, absolutely. And we're not talking about Taylor Swift today.
We're not.
How could we? Because we're talking about something very special.
Tell us what we're talking about.
Well, we're talking about our 2 home countries, Australia and France, and we're calling this episode Down Under and the French Connection. So, dear listeners, just to give you a bit of background, we're lovers of pop culture and we always have shared whatever Australian things I was interested in. I always shared with you, Georgie, and likewise, you always told me about the French things that you've come across along the way. And we thought we'd dedicate an episode to the concept of popular culture from our respective countries in the other person's country. I don't know how clear that was, but it'll get clearer along the way.
Hope so. I hope for me it'll be.
Hopefully, yeah. No,
I hope I make sense. But it's true because, and I'm hoping if you don't talk about this element, I'll certainly bring it up. But as we've, been friends for longer and longer and discover more about each other, there was a certain little mini break that we took that I didn't realise that somewhere where we were walking to was very instrumental in you coming to Australia. You're having to think.
yes, I am having a thing.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's do it.
Bring it up. I will bring it up.
No, let's do it. So basically, how we're gonna proceed with the topic that we're discussing today, bearing in mind that we're always coming to you, dear listeners, from our respective perspectives, as myself, a journalist, you, a PR specialist, Georgie.
Yes.
And we've both worked in international events as well. So that's where we are coming from.
Exactly. And I should say, you're not representing the whole of France. I'm not representing the whole of Australia. So this is purely our views. But I do have an about last time before we kick in.
Yes, of course. No, I was definitely going to the about last time. I wasn't going to dive into the topic yet.
You can see that we've had a week off. I should also say it is 7 a.m. my time. It's 11 p.m. Vicken's time.
That's right.
Recording this. So this could go any which way.
Disclaimer.
You need a little shot, and I could have like a Bloody Mary in the morning or something.
Well, what tells you I haven't had one before the show?
Correct. I'm drinking a drink with a magnesium boost.
I do like a magnesium boost.
Yeah, same.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
All right, so let's turn back time and see what we've got about the previous episode. And sometimes it's about the previous episodes, plural, because these topics never stop fascinating us, the few ones that we discussed. Listeners, go back and listen if you haven't.
Exactly. Well, my about last time is about the last episode, which is Taking in the Feud. So anyone who didn't listen to that, be sure to jump on episode 5, where we talked about feuds in pop culture, and realise that we disagree on most feuds and where we stand on them. But this is more just, I alluded to something in that episode, which was our good friend Aretha Franklin, and the fact that she had perhaps thrown a little shade on some people, but then I didn't actually elaborate what that was. So Aretha Franklin did a interview, I believe it was about an upcoming album maybe called Divas. I'm sure I'll need to clarify this in the next episode. And she was asked, they said in, sort of the vein of you recording about divas, we'd like to ask you about some female singers. And I did write this down because I think you need to say this word for word to really get the essence. So the interviewer says, what comes to mind when I say Adele? And Aretha says, young singer, good singer. Alicia Keys, young performer, good writer, producer. Taylor Swift, okay, great gowns, beautiful gowns. Whitney Houston, Whitney was a talent, definitely a talent. She had a gift. Nicki Minaj, I'm going to pass on that. I mean, great gowns, beautiful gowns. That is a line that has to go down in history.
I mean, I think it already has, actually. And that was a very good album, that Divas album, where Aretha Franklin covered some songs by past and present divas, including Rolling in the Deep, I believe, by Adele. So, yeah, I mean, Aretha Franklin has always had this thing of saying it like she meant it. So I was not surprised.
And Aretha Franklin can. And credit to her, she found something positive. She obviously doesn't rate, well, it doesn't appear that she rated Taylor's voice or music in this. I mean, this interview was recorded a few years ago, maybe, at that time she didn't feel like this. But you have to give it to her because she still found something positive to say.
Mm-hmm.
Although I've never thought of Taylor's gowns. To me, Taylor's not a very ball gown kind of person. But, she found something positive to say, and credit to her for that.
Look, I mean,
She put a
You know,
PR
we were
spin
talking
on
about
it.
Madonna and Christina. No, but absolutely. And we were talking about Madonna and we were talking about Christina Aguilera in the previous episode, saying that those artists' fans loved them and supported them, but were well aware that they could be snappy and dismissive and a little mean sometimes. And I think Aretha Franklin, you know, fell in that category as well of just, you know, laying it like it is and just yeah, it was fascinating to see her. And I mean, it's not the first, I mean, Taylor Swift is not, or Nicki Minaj in this interview, not the first.
No.
Sometimes just a look from Aretha Franklin was enough.
And it's what she doesn't say that the power is in.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
So that was my about last
Oh,
time.
well.
What about you?
Well, I do have an about last time because I mixed up a couple of terms when I brought up you know, sensitivity, and I referred to it as hypersensitive. Hypersensitive is a different thing. What I meant to say was highly sensitive. Highly sensitive is a concept that came up in the 1990s for people who feel things in a more intense way than, you know, the majority of the people. So we're thinking that about 20% of the people are considered highly sensitive. So I just use hypersensitive. I think people kind of understood what I meant, but I still wanted to go back to that. And I mean, I was thinking about the crossover episode, and I mean, obviously, it's now all over the place. And I watched the Academy of Country Music Awards before I left the United States to come to Europe, hosted by Reba McEntire. I love Reba McEntire. I mean,
Who doesn't?
fascinating woman. I mean, and the way she hosted was, and I love that, and I believe that to be true, is that she was referring to everyone as her good friend. So there wasn't a person, there wasn't a person that took to the stage that night that apparently Reba isn't good buddies with, which I mean, I get that. She is, you know, one of the queens of country music for sure. She's still around. She's a coach on The Voice at the moment. Well, the season wrapped, I think, a couple of days ago in the States. And so I was thinking about all these artists that took to the stage at the Academy of Country Music Awards. If you think about Noah Kahan, Gwen Stefani, Avril Lavigne, Dua Lipa, I mean, absolutely. I mean, Post Malone, crazy amount of people. And then now we're told that, I mean, Zayn Malik has released a country album and Lana Del Rey is going to release a country album. It is absolutely crazy in a good way that all of these artists are, you know, crossing over. And I mean, this concept of crossover, which you referred to on one of the posts on our Instagram page as well. I mean, everyone is talking about the concept of crossover now and analyzing it in ways we actually hadn't before.
So, so I have two questions. Why do you think suddenly country is a genre that people are going into? And is this just a flash in the pan and then, you know, these artists go back to their other music genre and we never hear from them again? And then what does that mean? I do realize this is three questions. What does that mean for the country music listening audience? Or it doesn't matter how long this hangs around for? And that is four questions.
Well, look, I have to commend all of these artists who are stepping over into country. Country is a very specific genre lyrically and musically. And I think we actually needed to expand the horizons of every musical genre has had its renaissance or reawakening at one point, you know, with pop and R&B, so many different. Country was one of the genres that had actually stayed pretty much the same, with some artists that were a little more pop leaning. But now, if you look at it, I think there is a bigger crossover appeal also for artists who are full-on country artists, but who are collaborating with, you know, folk Americana artists or more pop artists. So it is a two-way street. It's not like someone knocked down the door into the country music genre and everyone's following suits.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of interaction in a good way between country music and pop. And I think that country needed this also to become a little more international. We've had along the way some artists like Dolly Parton and Shania Twain and some songs that were almost like one-hit wonders through the years, but we actually needed an established international country scene. I mean,
Yeah.
Taylor Swift certainly helps, but she didn't blow up internationally before she actually did the full transition into pop.
Yes.
So I think it's been something that's been brewing for years, and now it's happening. I don't know if that answers your question. What does it say?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
I'll be
Well,
interested to see what happens in a year's time with
hmm.
artists going over into country.
Yes. Let's see. And I also wanted to say something, and now's the time to say it, is that watching The Voice in the United States, I think The Voice has also done a lot for country music. Um, and if you think about the fact that they always had one country artist on the panel of coaches,
Yeah.
a full-on identified as the country person of the panel. Now, for this season, they had two because they had Dan and Shay, and they also had Reba McEntire. And it also creates, and it's not like a country singer auditioning is necessarily going to go to the country artist as their coach.
Yes.
So there's a lot of, I think, interactions. And I have to give credit to The Voice for also opening that door a little bit in terms of also collaborations and just getting a bunch of artists together because if you think about the Grammys, apart from maybe Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs' performance, or when they have tribute performances, one of them coming to mind is the one that they did for Aretha Franklin, where they had a very diverse group of women paying tribute to Aretha Franklin. I think Martina McBride was in that group. I think it was Martina McBride, Yolanda Adams, Florence Welsh, Christina Aguilera, and Jennifer Hudson. So talk about a diverse group of women. But apart from that, it's very compartmentalized,
Yes.
considering, I mean, not counting Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs, who performed this year, but the Grammys are a show where the performances are still very genre specific, right?
Yes, yes.
So,
Well, let's watch
yes,
this space.
Sorry?
Let's watch this space.
Yes, absolutely. I'm curious to see what's going to happen. And also, I mean, we'll talk about crossover more in this episode because I have something that I want to tie in with our Down Under and the French Connection portion of the program.
Well, and I'd just like to tie into Reba McEntire referring it to everyone as her good friend. And just a shout out to Nicki Minaj, who held a moment's silence for her dear friend, Princess Diana, at her concert in Birmingham. So let's just take a moment for Nicki, who referenced and had a tribute to her dear friend, Princess Diana.
Did she really?
She did really. Yes, I believe she was talking to someone in the audience and it transpired they were from Wales. And then she talked about her dear friend, Princess Diana, and held a moment's silence for her, which, of course, has got everyone looking at the year that Princess Diana died and the year that Nicki Minaj was born. So, you know.
Oh, well, I mean, I must have been on the plane when that happened.
Well, perhaps a little incident at Amsterdam airport where she, anyway.
I did want to say something about the feuds, though, because crossover was an episode that happened a week before, but the feud, or a few weeks before, actually. I just wanted to go back very quickly to the concept of the feuds in the media. And I think that what is interesting with the concept of the feuds that we discussed and dissected, to be honest, is I think it makes for very palatable media content. I think it's very much palatable because it kind of ties in with the kind of content that you can find online that is going to be very easy. You know, all those listicles and just pictures, picture after picture. It's kind of like also with the rise of Wikipedia and encyclopedic entertainment, I find that there's been a very kind of profitable environment for feuds to be documented even more. And then these stories are readily available. And, you know, if you have a newspaper article, every time you just have to add the latest in that feud developing, and it's just the paragraph at the top of your list. So it makes for very palatable content. We're also in the kind of, I mean, we did it on the show from a specific perspective of media analysis, but there's so many countdown videos of, you know, the biggest feuds in pop culture or in the movies, or and also it's very fit for social media. I mean, you got to love a thread when it comes to those. So
correct, and a lot of the on YouTube Shorts, if you know.
That's right. And a lot of those new formats that have developed in the past few years, the media content formats are actually very, they're the right fit for a feud to be dissected and talked about.
Absolutely. And, you know, I was thinking about the feuds episode, and I know I made a comment. We were talking about one of the feuds, and you said, so which side do you sit on? And I said, well, I'll go with the numbers and go with this person. And you very rightly said it's not about the numbers. But I do find sometimes that I look at the people, the supporting people of the people involved in the feud, and end up sort of judging, which is, you know, I mean, it's PR. It's very good PR on the feuders' part, is to get the more, I guess, reputable, trustworthy, well-received people in your corner, because if you're backed up by them. And I think, you know, if we had 10 more hours, we could have talked about the role that the sources play. And I mean, if we look at even Meghan Markle, when all those friends came out and spoke to People magazine, you know, even the other day I saw an article on news.com about Hugh Jackman's kids are supporting him through his divorce. Well, I would assume they would support him and their mum through a divorce. Like, I mean, it was such a bizarre article, but it was because sources said. Now, of course, we know, you know, sources may or may not be real, but there's a very interesting role from a PR point of view in who they get to come out and talk on your behalf or make comments on your side. And so I'm always very interested to, not always in the feud, but the people the people in the background, and who do I respect and think would have, which, I mean, this is such a judgment call on my part, but who do I think would have good judgment, and who are they kind of backing? So I think, you know, from a PR point of view, there's a whole another layer wrapped around the feuds of those who you get in your corner. Yeah. And how they're perceived, and who's got the best part of those people.
And I think a lot of people are now being kind of held hostage, not held hostage, but there are people that you can actually not say anything negative about. There's a kind of like a short list of people that you know are very, you know, you have to walk on eggshells around for sure. And then there's also a lot of, you know, just putting a microphone in your face and asking you a question about something that you know, potentially have nothing to say about. And I think that if you think about those red carpets where all kinds of unrelated questions are being thrown, I remember Celine Dion being asked about, and I don't even remember what it was, but I remember her very gracefully replying on a red carpet when she was asked about something else. And she was like, with all due respect, I'm here to support a film that I think is absolutely wonderful. I think that's, I mean, she contributed a song to a soundtrack or something. And she very gracefully said, I don't think it's the time and place to say anything about it. But that can also become a story of Celine Dion shuts down reporter on the red carpet because she was asked a question about something and didn't want to reply. So
well, I mean,
yes is a story, no is a story, just not silence is a story, everything is a story.
I mean, Aretha
and I know because I've done it in the past.
Yes.
So guilty.
Silences. No, but I mean, you're right, because if we go back to Aretha Franklin, she didn't say anything bad about Taylor. It was what she didn't say, but then that became a story. But I just want to say about Celine Dion before we move into this week's episode proper is I like Celine. I'm not a massive Celine fan in that I don't not like her, but I mean, I think she's got an amazing voice and I think she's completely bonkers. I think she's hilarious in interviews.
In a good way.
Absolutely in a good way. But when you talked about how graceful she was in that, in her response, it came up in my feed of her in a press conference. And we know, the love of her life, Renee, and how devastated she was when she passed away. So I've never thought of Celine as someone on the singles circuit trying to find love again. I think we all felt that pain that she experienced. But I saw her in a press conference, and it looked like it was following an awards show, where a journalist asked about, what's single life like? And I don't know the length of time between when she lost her husband and when this press conference was, but I thought, wow, that is to me, that was a completely inappropriate question. But the way she handled it with grace, to not embarrass the journalist, she made a little bit of a joke about it, but she also didn't play along and put her own emotions in check to kind of play the game. I just so much respect for her.
I do too, and I think she's a very smart person when it comes to being graceful in a way that she'll say what she wants to say, but always in a graceful way. I've never seen her. I think I've seen her shut down an interview once, very early on in her career, when she was already dating Renee, and in Quebec, her province of origin in Canada, the media were starting to realize that something was going on there. And I don't even want to go back to that because that was their private life. So, but Celine Dion has always said, and she's done a lot of interviews in France as well, that she was an open book and that she's shared her trials and tribulations, both professional and personal, with the public. So she's well aware that these questions are going to come and that she's going to have to answer. I think people pull for her even more thanks to that, because she's always shared. Has she overshared? It's not my place to say. Some people receive those additional, layers of information in a positive way. Some people think it's too much sometimes. I think every person can decide for themselves. And I also wonder how much training they get to answer these questions in the right way. And because I know Celine Dion went to school to learn English and speak English fluently, but do they teach you how to go on a talk show? I have always, you tell me, maybe?
I would say absolutely they do.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I mean, we only need to watch the Dixie Chicks Shut Up and Sing documentary to see, and when they were kind of, when they'd been completely ostracized by the country music scene, and so they had to shift, and they talk about having to get a whole new fan base. But you see the behind the scenes of which interviewers they're putting them with, what kind of questions they'll go for. And, it's a fascinating insight into that training. But I think absolutely they are. I think we forget sometimes that some of these people are doing these interviews in their second language.
Right.
Which is incredibly admirable. And I remember a journalist friend from the tennis, and we were talking about which tennis players he liked and didn't like. And he talked about which tennis, the smart tennis players that made you work harder as a journalist, that made you lift your game by the way they would answer questions, by the way they would call out things in the press conference. And I guess it's like, you hear about actors working with another actor saying, you know, they were so good that they made me want to be a better actor. I remember this journalist friend talking about certain tennis players made him have to be a far better journalist and be on his game when he went into those press conferences because of how smart they were, how they read the media, not in a sneaky way. I'm not saying that they were, you know, you had to be better to kind of get through their wall. They are just very smart people. And so I always find that fascinating too, about how the interviewee does drive the, I guess, the standard sometimes of the interviewer.
Oh, absolutely. And as you were saying, what you were saying just now, so many images. I mean, we've worked at events together, so many images of mixed zones and press conferences came to my mind of the very specific atmosphere that an interviewee can create when answering questions. And also, I mean, we also have to bear in mind that this is not the core of what these people do. If you think about athletes and if you think about artists,
Yes.
It's not the core of what these people do. It's a tool for some to promote what they're doing. So that would be the case for artists. But if you think about it, athletes don't necessarily need it. It's the public that needs it. So it's really striking the right balance of you know, what people expect from these people, from these athletes, on top of what they already give them, which is the sport and the performances. And for artists, if you think about some of these performers like Beyonce and Taylor and Rihanna, who are almost not giving interviews anymore, and I remember uttering these words of letting the music speak for itself without adding layer after layer after layer of context on it.
Yes.
I think it's a very important thing to remember as part of an audience, that this is not the core of what these people do. It's either a tool for them or something extra that they're giving you. And it's never something spontaneous. In the entertainment industry, it might be, but red carpets and mixed zones and press conferences are very codified. It's very much a list of what people have to do.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think of tennis, it's a requirement.
Yes,
of the
in many sports.
The ATP, the WTA, that you have to do a post-match press conference. And often the post-match press conference becomes the story. But if you think you know, I mean, imagine having a shocking day at work and then going home and having to talk to the media about it, which I know, you know, you can say they're playing a sport, they're not saving lives, absolutely. But still, they're humans and they've got emotions. And to have a shocking day on the court and then come out and have to do a press conference is, you know, it's pretty brutal. And then be, you know, just hammered with these questions. And then, of course, your response becomes a story in itself. But we are going to do an episode this season about media interviews and styles. And we may even add into that who we like as an interviewee, because I think Andy Murray is one of the, I mean, I love Andy Murray. He's one of the best for calling out shocking questions and all sorts of things in the kind of questions he gets in tennis.
In my work, I've seen people be incredibly graceful in interviews when you knew that there was some kind of hostility.
Yes.
You know, they were faced with a certain kind of hostility.
Yes.
So we have to give credit where credit is due, that it's not an easy thing to navigate on top of what you do, which is your performance, to provide all of that content as well.
Exactly. So, yes, we will have that episode because there's so many things we can talk about, you know, from stories of female actors, female actors, singers who are constantly asked about, do they want kids? Are they going to have kids? And in the background, they're going through, you know, some really challenging, you know, IVF or trying to conceive. But in the public, you're being grilled about it as if, you know, when are you going to start having kids? So there's all sorts of things. But we'll save that for another episode. We'll get into this week's.
Yes. Mhm.
Otherwise, we might be talking for 10 minutes about Down Under and the French Connection.
Shall we? Let's do it.
Oh, yes.
All right. Oh, okay. You're putting me on the spot now. No. I mean, my fascination for Australia and my love of Australia, didn't start with meeting you. I had already worked,
I'm
and I mean,
devastated to hear that.
it only made it better. No, it only made it better. But what I want to say is that even as a kid, I think that, I think it comes down to maybe seeing a picture of the Sydney Opera House one day and thinking, what a fascinating building. And, listening to some music from Australia, it felt, I mean, people who are younger will not realize, but it really felt like the other end of the world. Australia really felt like the other end of the world. And if you were told, you have to be on a plane for 20 something hours to reach Australia, to reach Sydney or Melbourne, it really felt very remote, not remote as in undeveloped, but remote really physically and geographically. So whatever we could get, I think, was whatever the media and the television channels back in the day were willing to give us. So there was something very intangible about Australia in the French public space back in the day, certainly starting in the 1980s, because that's when I was a kid and grew up. So there was a kind of a knowledge that Australia was there. But what I always felt interesting was whenever I was given a project in class or asked to do something about something in history class or geography class, I would always choose Australia as the topic. And I remember one of my first active acts of finding Australian things and bringing them into my world is I actually wrote a letter to the Australian embassy in Paris.
And what
And
age are you talking here?
I would have been 11, I think, 11 or 12. So I wrote a letter and said, I'm interested in Australia. There aren't a lot of resources. You had to go to the library to find like 3 books about Australia. Um, and I wrote to the embassy and I asked, do you have any pamphlets or booklets or anything that you could send me? And they actually replied. So, and they sent me some stuff. It was a little booklet and it was called Australia in Brief. So the Parliament House in Canberra was the picture on the front page, on the cover of the little booklet. And I mean, I think all of my closer circle or all my classmates had no idea that Canberra was the capital of Australia. And I'm going to reference, I mean, the terrible thing that happened at Bondi Junction a few weeks ago in Sydney, the stabbing in the shopping center.
Yeah.
Is I had to write to a journalist of a very famous news channel in France because they listed Sydney as the capital of Australia. So I had to I tweeted the channel and the journalist going, by the way, the capital of Australia is Canberra. And they updated the story and changed that little bit.
We appreciate your fact checking.
Well, I mean, it is a little.
But we're used to the world thinking Sydney's the capital.
Yes,
I mean,
and
I look at, everyone thinks Auckland's the capital of New Zealand.
Absolutely. And it was a question on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire back in the day. What is the capital of Australia?
There we go.
So,
okay, 11-year-old Vicken putting his pen to paper, writing his letter, posting it. But what was it, like, how had you discovered Australia before, in order to write that letter? Where had Australia popped up in your pop culture? Was it any one thing, or do you think it was just starting to kind of seep in?
In the 1980s, In Excess, Need You Tonight, Midnight Oil, Beds Are Burning, and Kylie Minogue, I Should Be So Lucky.
See, Kylie Minogue doesn't surprise me. In Excess doesn't, but I didn't. I mean, I'm a big Midnight Oil fan. I've seen them twice in concert. I know. Gee, wow, look at me. Such a fan. How exclusive. But I didn't realize they were big in France. What about Air Supply? Because Air Supply, Air Supply we've always been told that Air Supply and a great Australian band from the 70s and I guess early 80s were big in Central and South America. And I remember when I went to Central America and Cuba, traveling for 3 months, I had this joke that, as long as I hear Air Supply, and in every country, well, I only went to Chile and South America, but every country in Central America and in Cuba, I heard Air Supply in a taxi or in a supermarket. So, we kind of know there's certain artists that are big in certain countries, but I never realised Midnight Oil. And what surprised me about that is Midnight Oil, their songs are really political. And there's very much a cultural context of where those songs come from. We know exactly what they're singing about. So for them to resonate in another country, I find fascinating.
Well, I think that Beds Are Burning had a universal message of, what is happening to the planet on top of dealing with Australia-specific issues. But it also had to do back in the day, and I'm going to reference a medium that we hardly ever speak about is school books, the books that you have at school. And there was very little about Australia in those books. Australia was not studied as a geographical, or it wasn't studied in history or geography class. So if you wanted to learn more about it, as I said, you kind of had to raise your hand and say, okay, I'll do something about Australia to show the whole class and tell them about it. So that's what we did. I think Midnight Oil, Beds Are Burning for a long time was studied in English class in France. And I think it's a fascinating song because the lyrics are very layered. So it addresses the specific issues that Australia faces and has faced and is still facing with a more general universal message of, sustainability and what is happening to our environment. So I think I'm telling you, I use that song as a song, teaching it in class. And a lot of people actually knew what Beds Are Burning was. And I actually paired that song, just to add some more context to it, with Christine Anu's My Island Home, which at the turn of the century, considering the added verse that was added for the Sydney Olympics, it was also very interesting to kind of, it was almost like a three-parter where you could talk about Beds Are Burning and then My Island Home and then the newer version of My Island Home. So, but that came from me. Christine Anu's song was really me having lived in Australia and wanting to add that specific element.
Gosh, you've just, and it's so weird, not weird, that's the wrong word, but sitting in this hotel room overlooking Stadium Australia, I remember sitting in Stadium Australia for the closing ceremony of the Sydney Olympics, not with you, but you were there, and Christina Anu singing that song, and I just started crying. That song, and
I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it.
Correct. I don't come from the area of Australia that she comes from. I don't have the deep connection to country that our First Nations people do, and that the care that they take and have taken of our land and country and sea. But that song just hits. And what I like about that is I do think there has been an element, and I still think there is, not as much as when I was growing up, of cultural cringe in Australia. I think in white Australia, there was certainly this look to Europe and this history, and you'd say, oh, gosh, Europe's so much older than Australia. I mean, which is absolute rubbish. We've got one of the oldest, if not the oldest, populations in Australia, 60,000 plus years. But that history, it's getting a little bit better. I'd say we are so far away from embracing our First Nations history and what that means. And I mean that in, Indigenous food and song and the way we look at land and the way we stand on country and acknowledge country and care for country. but in the there has been this cultural cringe. So to have songs like My Island Home come along, that we were starting to be more proud, I think. And not to say I've always been a very proud Australian, so I'm not saying that, but we were brought up with a very we were settled, I'll say loosely, by the English. So we've always had this view, even though we are located in Oceania or Australasia, we've always had this view, that we're supposed to be connected with Europe. And obviously we have a lot of European immigrants. Melbourne has the biggest Greek population outside Athens, not outside another town in Greece. So it's Athens and then Melbourne and then another town in Greece. So we do have this inherent connection to Europe because of immigration, particularly after World War II. But yes, so when you start to get songs like My Beds Are Burning and Island Home, Australia was starting to get a much stronger identity in itself rather than looking to Europe and England.
And that you raise a very good point because, and maybe we could have led with that, but now is the right time to talk about it. What was interesting for me when discussing Australia in French pop culture and France in Australian pop culture was the concept of soft power, because you were talking about Australia looking to England as the country that settled, all the populations that came to Australia from the time it became a colony. I think the concept of soft power is very important here because the cultural impact and the cultural presence is also very much part of the soft power. So for people who don't know what soft power is any kind of power that a nation has that isn't military. So economic power and everything else cultural and political. So when it comes to the soft power now that nations are trying to push towards other countries and towards the world, I think in the past years, maybe past 30, 25 years, certainly there's been a lot of new developments of different kinds of culture that have been developing and people have paid notice. If you think about K-pop, for example, that's become this huge thing when it wasn't a few years ago, and has really put South Korea on the map in terms of as a destination, and of course bringing economic growth as well. And I think there are many examples of this, but all of a lot of nations trying to let's say promote a facade of democracy by organizing major sporting events or major cultural events. So I think there's a lot of that. And we stand at $12 with the Tina Arena jar, but I'm going to mention her many times today. So I'm going to start now. I remember an interview that Tina Arena
pause
did.
you for a moment because
Yes, please.
I was at a lunch last Friday and some people were asking me how the podcast was going, and I said, oh, really good. And they said, oh yeah, we've got to tune in. And I said, well, the next episode we're doing about France in Australian pop culture and vice versa. And they said, oh, you'll have to talk about Tina Arena. That was the first thing they said.
What did you say? Did you say we might?
Only you knew.
Yeah, right. I mean, we had to greenlight this with our producers, but look, so Tina Arena was also very interestingly spoke about Americana. And I find it fascinating that Australia as a nation is also, when it comes to pop culture, so fascinated by Americana. And I've been following the charts in Australia for 25 years, ever since I was a student in Sydney. And to have seen the Australian music scene kind of fall apart at the seams, and fewer and fewer artists and more American artists being, celebrated and really making up most of the charts. I think that Tina Arena, and far from me to want to, tell Australia what it needs to do, but I think Tina Arena raises a good point. But I also think that, soft power culture and pop culture has been a very important component of soft power. So if you think about America's presence that is consistent in every single aspect, I find it also because English is the vehicular language around the world. If you want to be understood anywhere in the world, that's the language you're going to speak. But I'm going to throw it back to a story that I referenced once on the show already, was this story on Billboard magazine where someone was saying, oh, music is more international than ever. Music has always been international. It's just that America was too busy focusing on itself that it ever paid attention to any other kind of music in any other kind of language. And forcibly now, and there was this very interesting article about the Met Gala as well, also on Billboard magazine, where they're K-pop specialist.
Oh, yes.
And it's an article I shared with you that said, you know, Stray Kids remarks by Met Gala photographers proves need for inclusivity, because apparently Stray Kids came. They're a band of many members. I'm sorry, I don't remember. I think 7. And they were all wearing a different version of the same suit. And apparently there was some disparaging comments by the photographers who had to photograph 7 people at once wearing different versions of the same outfit, and at the same time not really knowing how to handle the situation. Now, we've spoken about this also in terms of what does it actually mean in terms of how these photographers were prepped to be able to do their job at the Met Gala? Was there a photo? I mean, we come from events, and we know that at an event, there is a photo briefing for all the photographers covering the event before it actually starts. And that is arguably one of the most important things happening on a site the day of a football match or any kind of competition. And if you think about some other sports like gymnastics or athletics, the layers of complexity to actually deal with photographers doing in-field operations in a stadium, or, you know, and if you think about it, the Met Gala is kind of like the same thing, or if you think about the Cannes Film Festival. So I think that this article, Stray Kids Remarks by Met Gala Photographers Proves Need for Inclusivity, it kind of misses part of the point. Of course, inclusivity 100%, but I think that it's really seeing this from a perspective of, I believe that there has been this inclusivity elsewhere, but then in some parts, people are only now realizing that it's needed, when in other parts, it's been happening for years.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I went off script for a bit, but I felt it was the right time to mention this.
No, absolutely. And look, I mean, speaking of the Cannes Film Festival, watching Kelly Rowland's situation on the red carpet with the security guard who, and for those of you who haven't seen it, a female security guard sort of rushes Kelly Rowland up the stairs. And many others. And yes, but of course, it was the Kelly Rowland story that broke first. She's trying to wave to the crowd, to the photographers. This female security guard, I would say manhandles her. I know that's a very sexist term, manhandling, but she has her arm around her and she's trying to push her up. And Kelly Rowland is aggrieved by this. And so then words are spoken on the red carpet. And so the story came out, and it did, acknowledge that the security guard or the usher would definitely have been given the direction, get people up the stairs. And from an event management point of view, I completely understand what the direction she would have been given. The same person proceeds to do it to another person, well, at least 2 that we know of. Yeah. And, you've got to balance this. Well, don't ever put your hand on me. I mean, if that had happened to me on the carpet, and I had this last year at a conference where one of the speakers was needing to change his slides, and I was sitting at my laptop. I know we're really going off script. We will get back to things. And he came over and he stood on my right side and put his arm around my shoulders and put his hand on my left-hand shoulder and leaned in while we were updating the slides. And I actually said, can you please take your hand off me? You are in my space. And it wasn't that I was, it wasn't in a sexual that I thought it was inappropriate. It was just inappropriate that I didn't know this person and he had completely invaded my space. And I was quite proud of myself after for actually standing up and saying, please take your hand off me and move out of my space. So when I watched this security guard / usher on the red carpet, touching these women, pushing them like with her arm around them, shuffling them up the stairs, this is their moment on the red carpet, these stars.
Yes.
I absolutely understood Kelly Rowland's reaction. And once again, it's as Taylor would say, it's the reaction being reported on, not the behaviour. I think the second article started to see a theme in the behaviour and was more sympathetic to the stars. But so it's interesting, isn't it, around, I think in these events that we've worked in, we do a lot of training about inclusivity, about cultural diversity, gender diversity, the right way to address people, to speak to people. I remember the Sydney Olympics, I think, had one of the best training programs for that. But you're right. Then there's this whole other layer that, like the media, that perhaps aren't being brought into these conversations. So, but I'll segue back by bringing us back into France via the Cannes Film Festival.
That's right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you. So we left it at the 80s and you kind of Midnight Oil and In Excess and Kylie Minogue. And I mean, there was always this kind of fascination aspect of, Australia is so far away. So I remember a lot of, teenage magazine stories about, Kylie Minogue being asked about Australia and maybe a couple of pictures and then they tried to, which is what I was saying before, of the media used to decide what kind of content we were fed. And so when Kylie Minogue became so popular with I Should Be So Lucky and the subsequent hits, France decided that we needed to have Neighbours. So, so they started airing Neighbours on what is now known as France Television. But I think the ratings were so low that they even stopped. I mean, they should have really started at the episode where Kylie Minogue arrives because, when she kind of breaks in through the window or something.
Yes. And she's in her overalls. And I believe Scott thinks she's a thief.
Yes, and she threatens to punch him or something.
Yes.
So that's the story of the very short-lived time that Neighbours had on French television. It was just a matter of maybe weeks, maybe a few months, but that was it. Yeah.
What about Home and Away? Did you ever? Because it's always fascinated me that in the UK, Neighbours is much more popular than Home and Away. Because to me, Home and Away is the kind of stereotypes, not all of, certainly some of Australia live by the beach and have that lifestyle, but to me that was a bit more the idealistic surf and sun Australian lifestyle. So I've always been fascinated that Neighbours, which is just in a suburb in Melbourne, is the show that was more popular in certain countries.
And I think that for a long time, the the popularity of Neighbours in the UK is what kept it on the air in Australia. Absolutely. Because they knew, because it was big. So which one is Ada Nicodemu on? Is it Home and Away? Okay, all right. We're going to talk about her in a few minutes. So we had Neighbours for a few weeks, but if you didn't follow Kylie Minogue or Jason Donovan, because obviously, especially for you and everything, you never really would even know that Neighbours was ever on. This is the right time to do. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and there's so many. Like we talk about context and cultural context. When Kylie Minogue she'd been in a show as a child, or a couple of episodes, or one episode with Jason Donovan called Skyways, but she was mainly known as Danny Minogue's sister. Danny Minogue was on a show, Young Talent Time, I guess, like the
with Tina Arena
Club, kind of that, young kids entertainment show. So she had been on another show in between called The Henderson Kids, great Australian TV show, but she was still pretty much known as Danny Minogue's sister. So when Kylie
That's
came
right.
into Neighbours, it was very much around Danny Minogue's sister. So, you know, and then Jason Donovan's dad, Terence Donovan, was a well-known Australian actor. His mum, Sue McIntosh, was a well-known newsreader, I think, in Australia. So when these stars were coming in, we did know them from different things. So, you know, that which is a cultural context that doesn't translate if you don't know the history.
No, because, and that's why in France, when it came to Australian popular culture, we only got these like standalone items that were completely devoid of context. And because there was no internet, now if you see something, you can Google whatever you want to know that you don't already know. But
Yes.
back in the day, it took so much effort, or you had to have an Australian connection or a friend or someone. And then, you know, all of these embassies and consulates and organizations, their focus was not to bring popular culture to, you know, the masses. It was to do, you know, the admin work and the political representation. So it was very hard to connect the dot and kind of make something as a whole of what Australian popular culture would be. But I remember, and I was thinking about examples of literature that we did we ever get any literature? And I'm not talking about the book, but I'm going to talk about the film, Playing Beatty Bow,
Yes.
which is a very famous, is it a children's book?
Yes, I would say young adult, maybe like
Yeah, so
early high school, I think.
So I'd never heard about the book, but we had the film, and the film would air very often on French television. So I remember that particular film, although it wasn't a representation of modern Australian popular culture because it's all time travel in the film and in the book. But that's one of those things that we got. But then in the 1990s, it kind of blew up because within a couple of years, we got Muriel's Wedding, Strictly Ballroom, and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, kind of this explosion of Australian cinema that was very specific, that conveyed a very specific atmosphere. And that's really when I started to get interested. And it was also at the same time kind of that Sydney got the organization of the Olympics for 2000, because that was 1993.
Yes.
So it really started putting Australia on the map, and in a brilliant way, because I mean, Muriel's Wedding was those were three very popular films in France.
Exactly. And while we and I mean, I say this with a lens of having studied cinema at university, so not everyone would perhaps feel this, but I think the Australian cinema has always had it's been a very strong Australian cinema scene. I think less now. I certainly think we get less Australian films made now with Australian stories. But, you know, there's some amazing stories and amazing movies. And I'm not talking about your Mad Maxes and your Crocodile Dundees. I'm talking about, you know, The Cars that Ate Paris, or, you know, from the 70s right through 80s. But certainly even in Australia, we felt that explosion of cinema with Strictly Ballroom, with Muriel's Wedding, particularly Muriel's Wedding and Priscilla, because they came out at pretty much the same time. Certainly we felt this explosion of it. And, you know, I mean, I remember Muriel's Wedding, not Muriel's Wedding, because Muriel's Wedding was a darker comedy. You know, I mean, to me, Muriel's Wedding is I love it, but it is a heartbreaking movie of the themes that is happening in that. But Priscilla, I remember when the costume designers were nominated for an Oscar, and you know, she went in the credit card dress. I think it was like the gold American Express credit card. So even here we felt that boom of these well-known movies, more than perhaps sort of the smaller niche movies that had been very popular in Australia but hadn't broken out as much on the international.
Yes. And I think that they spoke to something very human in all of us, these films. Yes. But there was something very universal about them. If you think about Muriel's life and what she was going through. And if you think about, I mean, gay representation at the time in the movies, what those films were few and far between. And to have this as a festive, as a celebration of sorts, and even Strictly Ballroom in terms of how it portrayed the outcasts and the coming of age thing. They were very layered, and I have to say the musical component as well. There was something very universal about the music. I discovered ABBA through Muriel's Wedding.
See, ABBA made it big in Australia before it made it big in a lot of other countries. So ABBA has always been, isn't that interesting? I mean, my sister's prep photos, so, first year of primary school, I have to get this right. Her friend is in an ABBA T-shirt and she's in ABBA socks. A good friend of mine went to the airport when ABBA came out in the 80s. My sister's got, I think it's the 1980 ABBA yearbook. So ABBA has always been very big in Australia. So for us, it was very natural that ABBA was in those movies. I think it's PJ Hogan, the writer and creator of Muriel's Wedding. It's loosely based on his life, or it's inspired by his autobiographical, but I believe it was originally set in Melbourne, I think, and then they moved it to the Gold Coast to Porpoise Spit, for another context. I think with Priscilla, the fact they go to where did they go? Oh God, they go to the outback. Cooper Pedy, is it, or Broken Hill?
I don't know.
I do, for people in Australia listening, I do realise that Cooper Pedy and Broken Hill are nowhere near each other, but they're both outback towns.
Even I know that.
I do know my geography. I just can't remember which town. I think it's Broken Hill. But, we know that is a very outback town. Yeah. It's very remote. Well, it's a big town, but it's remote. They hit on those challenges that minority groups would have going into quite a closed town like Broken Hill.
Yes.
So when you're watching it, you know exactly what they're talking about. And I think also to have some very well-known actors play those characters in Priscilla was also a big thing.
Yes.
Now,
well, for us, they weren't. And for us, they weren't. Exactly. Because, as I said, we had only seen them in that. We had no idea. We did not have any context. And going through the list along the way, a couple more come to my mind. But one of the biggest kind of successes, we used to have this tradition in France on France television. Every summer, we would have this series that was not like a series with seasons. It was just this show that had like 12 to 15 episodes. And one of the summers was Return to Eden. And it was a massive, massive, massive hit with all of these actors that we never heard about again. I don't know how big they ended up being in Australia, but
so big, yes. And of course, we never was a mini series, a limited mini series that then turned into a show. And of course, the series had different actors from the.
So I think they would have played it. They would have played the mini series one summer and then come back and replay that and add all the other episodes after. So, and that I remember seeing pictures of Sydney and Perth in, some frames and I was always on the lookout for, are they going to show the Opera House? Or that's why I like the, especially for you video so much, because Kylie Minogue at the beginning is writing a letter and you can see the Sydney Opera House in the background. So we had that, and we also had Hey Dad on French television.
We won't talk any further about Hey Dad.
It was there. So we had that on. So you know what? They had a rotation of the Cosby Show, Who's the Boss, and then at one point we got Hey Dad. Yeah. I'm not joking. I think.
Can I ask, were these shows dubbed or subtitled?
No, they were all dubbed. They were all dubbed, which kind of, I think so much was lost in translation because Australia is such a specific language as well.
Were they dubbed with someone speaking French with an Australian accent?
How would you even do that?
Because can I tell you, I mean, Return to Eden has, I mean, I know I have a broad Australian accent, but Return to Eden has some very broad Australian accents in.
I need to watch it in English once. I've only ever
Oh,
seen it in
you
French.
do. You do.
But I do
That
have to
show had
say,
everything because it had the glamour. It had the woman for, you know, being the wife being pushed in and being recovered by like a crocodile hunter, sort of, wasn't he? And then, of course, the plastic surgery and then the reveal at
we
the
had
end.
Crocodile Dundee too.
Well, everyone, yes.
Everyone did. I don't
Everyone
think
had
I've ever
Crocodile
seen
Dundee.
it. But you were talking about dubbing.
Yes.
And I have to reference this very quickly because one of the first, probably one of the only things I ever won by sending in, you know, you used to cut a piece of the magazine and put your name down and everything and send it, and maybe you'd win something. I won the VHS of Kylie Minogue's The Delinquents, the film. Um, so, and because I'd asked all of my friends in middle school to actually give me that little coupon that I could send back, and so I sent one with my address, one with my auntie's address, one with my other auntie's address. So anyone I knew, I was like, "Can I use your address for this?" And then one day my auntie calls me and goes, "You have a parcel here."
Was
I'm
it only
like,
was it only one entry per person?
well, I think so, yes. And so what ended up happening is that I got The Delinquents on VHS, but it was the dubbed version in French. And what was so disturbing is that the person dubbing Kylie Minogue was the person who usually dubbed Alyssa Milano on Who's the Boss.
Oh.
My brain was like all over the place.
Yes, yes.
Something was not working.
Yes.
Just, I'm going to leave it at that.
Have
But
you seen
then,
The Delinquents without dubbing? I think you need to because there's some good accents in The Delinquents.
oh, I'm sure. I need to go back, but I'm conscious of time as well, and I want to
Yes.
hear about France. But I just wanted to, yes. So we had all those films, and I became a fan of Australian cinema through those films.
Yes.
And I would always seek out whatever Australian films would play on French TV. And luckily, at around that time, for Muriel's Wedding, Strictly Ballroom, and Priscilla, we started having television channels in French in France who would actually play the films in English subtitled. So major, I mean, you can't watch these films dubbed. It's just impossible.
And I mean, this just plays into things that we've talked about in previous episodes about the difference that the streaming services have created, because
yes,
I can go on and watch, you know, a French show that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. So for those younger people listening, we're talking about in the days of pre-streaming where all you could watch was what was on, you know, and in Australia it was kind of 4 or 5 channels.
yes.
So for, and it was funny, before this episode, I did a little vox pop of a few people to see what they would say in how France, you know, became into our pop culture sphere. And I would say France has always featured to us, but from a historical point of view, a cultural and historical point of view, in that in school, you know, you had a choice of some languages, probably French, German, Japanese became a lot more popular in sort of the late 80s, 90s, but French was particularly a key language. So a lot of us learnt French at school. We grew up with doing, you know, the Alliance Française competitions. We grew up, and I remember we used to all be fascinated, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was that French kids would finish school a half day on a Wednesday or something because you played sport on a Saturday. So we were learning about French culture through learning the language of French. And then with that became history. So for me, I was thinking back to, you know, France has always been represented to us. Well, I guess there's two things. France, we have seen France through the lens of history. And, you know, France has always been presented to us as a very cultural, fashion, cuisine country. So from a historic point of view, that's what we have learnt about France. Seeing France in a pop culture sense has often been through an English or an American lens. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But I remember growing up, and I was a kid at school who was fascinated with World War II books, which to me, when I think back, World War II seemed so long ago. It was only 40 years prior to me reading these books. And I remember there were 2 books that stood out to me, which was When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, and then 10 and 20. So 10 and 20 was set in a village in France where 20 French fifth graders were taken up and kind of sheltered away from Nazi soldiers coming. When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, it was about a girl and her family that had a Jewish family that kept relocating and ended up in Paris. So I learned a lot about Paris through these historical references. And then, of course, through school. So it was always around, and obviously the French Revolution was a big one. So I know these aren't pop culture, but just kind of setting the scene that we grew up knowing about France. And I remember I learned French. So my middle name's Fleur. I learned French because I wanted to be a fashion designer in France, and my label was going to be Georgie and Fleur. And I thought I was so, it was the 80s, so let's just put that in context. So that's, and I studied French revolutions in my final year of high school. So that was, we certainly had that context of the history. And then with that, and through our learning of French at school, we were then introduced to elements of French culture. And I remember this was the first thing I wrote down, maybe embarrassingly, when I was putting my notes together for this episode. And when I asked a friend, what do you think of? And she said this same thing, is Paul Bocuse the chef? Because we used to watch Paul Bocuse videos, VHS, of his cooking shows in one of my French classes. And I remember we were always astounded with how much salt he put in his food. And I mean, this was the 90s, so we were still putting a lot of salt in our food. And then I remember in Melbourne, we had this fancy new department store, Daimaru, which was, this exclusive, it was a short-lived department store open up, and there was a Paul Bocuse cafe. And, this was kind of really exciting. Even though we had French Australian chefs like Jacques Raymond, certainly was big in Melbourne with the restaurant. We had Gabriel Gatte, a French chef who was very big in our Australian pop culture. And he's, I've worked with him. He's an absolute delight. But Paul Bocuse was this, very well-known French person. So we were introduced to France through these cultural references of learning French at school. The other, and we certainly knew Coco Chanel, we certainly knew Christian Dior. So our references, I would say kind of our references to France were around food and the chefs, was around fashion, Yves Saint Laurent, Coco Chanel, Christian Dior, and then sport.
Cacharel.
Sorry?
Cacharel.
It wasn't a big one,
The fragrance brand.
Yeah, I would still say not. Oh, well, I know you're referencing a certain.
I'm referencing a specific fragrance, yes.
I'm referencing a specific fragrance.
It's called Anaïs.
I grew up in the 80s with my mum who loved, and as I love to say to Vicken, Anay. How should I say it?
Anaïs, but that's something that would have come from the store. Maybe that's how they said it in Australia.
Oh, I think I just had no idea how to say it. But it was, that was a huge fragrance in its day.
It still is.
Still is now. Exactly.
My grandmother still wants some whenever I go to visit her. So
those were our cultural references were through history. Well, I'll start through history. Particularly around because World War II was a big thing in our history curriculum, and even World War One. Australia is not great at learning our own history. We're very good at learning other countries' histories. So those references, and obviously because a large contingent of Australians fought in World War One and World War Two, and so there's a huge connection with certain parts in France, particularly where Australians went into battle, and there's huge, memorial and cemeteries with a lot of Australians.
There is a cemetery in my hometown of Lyon, which is also the hometown of Paul Bocuse. So there is a cemetery that I drive, and I've been to it many times, that I actually drive past, and you see these. Yes, absolutely.
So our references through that, references through cuisine. One I didn't add is references through art. definitely. You know, we'd go to the art gallery on our excursions. We'd learn about the Impressionists at school. Everyone knew about Monet's garden. And, you know, when we'd go traveling, everyone had to go to Giverny, to Monet's garden.
Yes.
And sport was the other one. And I remember talking to my partner about this, is the Tour de France. We would all watch the Tour de France. Some would watch it for, and still, I shouldn't say would, we still do. Some would watch it for the cycling. Most of us watched it for the scenery.
Of course.
These were kind of the references we were getting. And then obviously literature. So we've, you know, Madeline, the book, the children's book, certainly other literary classics like Madame Bovary, Les Miserables. And then, of course, we had the musical of Les Mis come out. And that was a big moment in Australia when that musical came out. But still, that, you know, that was obviously English producers of that musical. So once again, we're seeing certain things around French culture through an American or an English lens, and I'll expand on that. And the story of O. I'm just going to leave that in there as a literary classic.
Of course.
But then I was thinking about the representation of France in our pop culture. And I, you know, was starting to think of things. There was a really good video game when I was in school called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? And it was, you know, Interpol were after someone. And so you would get clues. And I remember one of the clues would always be, they're eating a baguette on the Champs-Élysées. And so you'd go, oh, they're in Paris. And then you know, squirrel. And you had
Interpol were after them?
Well, Interpol were looking for these people that were on the run.
Interpol is based in my hometown of Lyon as well. So many Lyon connections.
So many Lyon connections. But and I mean, I'm talking about a game where you were on your keyboard, you know, hitting things. But Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego was fantastic.
I mean, that title alone is just fascinating.
I know. So you would get these references like that. And then I remember National Lampoon's European Vacation.
Oh, my God, yes.
And, of course, Rusty meets this girl in Paris and they go to the, you know, Eiffel Tower, and she's this very stylish person with the beret and, you know, a style that we would never be able to replicate. So very much and there was I remember an English show called Fresh Fields about an older couple. Then they moved to France and it's called French Fields. So we were constantly getting, and To Catch a Thief, the Hitchcock movie set in the south of France. We were constantly getting these references to France through an English and American eyes. But then we started to get, and you know, there's so many more movies that I could talk about, like, I mean, Moulin Rouge, you know, obviously it's not filmed there, but it's set there. The Da Vinci Code, you know, I mean, Paris plays a big part in that. But then we did start to get French films more mainstream, and I think Chocolat was one of the first of those.
Love that film.
Amélie.
Very poor. I mean, it's a very specific representation. You have to forget that these people should be speaking French and not English. And there's so many elements, but somehow it kind of works.
Exactly.
And anything with Juliette Binoche, of course.
Well, do you know what? That's correct, because we knew of her, so we go and see the film. And that was another thing. Learning French at film, you would always go to the French Film Festival. Run by the Alliance Française. So, you know, you had seen French films. And Amélie was another one. The Apartment, was it The Apartment? I need to think of that movie. But
I'm not sure.
We had certain...
We have a lot of films.
You do have a lot of films. And we certainly know that France has a big French, you know, a cinema culture. So that's how we were tapping in. And then I remember there was an ad campaign in the 80s for Yoplait, and it was Yoplait, it's French for yogurt. And I remember we were like, oh, and then we'd learn French and go, Yoplait is actually not the word for yogurt. But I mean, we were completely sold on their marketing campaign.
You know what? I was in New Zealand last year working, and I know that it's a different country, but I'm still going to plug this. I saw some Yoplait yogurts in New Zealand that were called Vigor, not Vigor, but Vigor. the French way. And
Yes.
I'd never seen those. They don't exist in France. So it's a common thing to actually use a fancy French version of an English
Oh,
word to kind
very
of
much.
convey. And I think one of the best ones for me, living in the States and having is work kind of lived around the world, is Bonne Maman jam. For me,
Oh,
that's France in a jar.
yes.
So,
And working with the Bastille Day French Festival, we've certainly had jars of Bon Maman as part of that festival.
mhm.
But it's
But can I just say something though, and react to a few of the things that you just said?
Mm,
Um, certainly, I mean, you were talking about the language. Absolutely. One of the first stories that I did in journalism school at UTS, because it was the year of the Olympics, was a story about where French, because French is still today an official Olympic language. If you
yes.
remember all of the signs around the Olympics
Well,
in
because
Sydney,
it was
everything was in French and English.
correct,
And
because it was
I remember,
A Frenchman who brought back the modern Olympics.
that's right, Pierre de Coubertin. So I remember going to the Alliance Française in Sydney and interviewing their deputy director about where French language stood as a language in Australia back in the day in
Mm.
2000. And she actually told me that I think it was still the second language that was learned, the second
Yes,
foreign language that was learned the most in Australian schools. And
yes,
it is still very widely taught. I think it
absolutely.
depends on the states. Some states really still, or territories, but some states really do still have a lot of people learning
Oh,
French.
absolutely. And I mean, I remember when I came through high school in the early 90s, as Japanese was coming more into effect, but it was
Yes,
French, Italian, German, probably. But then as the years has come on, Indonesian became a very popular language
yes.
in
Hmm.
the schools. And I think there was a push that, I don't know, were we going to trade with Indonesia more? So was it handier to have an Indonesian language? Interestingly, Spanish has never been a big language here. But when you think about the amount of countries that speak Spanish, I always think it's a shame we haven't had more. That hasn't been a big language, but certainly French was something. And I mean, even the popularity of apps like Duolingo,
Hmm.
people are jumping back on. And I remember talking to friends saying, "Oh, I'm tapping back into the French or the language that we learnt." So, and there's certainly primary schools in Melbourne, and I'm sure other parts of Australia that are dual languages. So they learn half of their lessons in French and half in English.
Hmm. Oh, I'm not surprised. I used to live right next to the international school in Sydney when I was at UTS, and I could see kind of you could hear some people speaking French, which wasn't very common back in the day in Sydney. But I
Yeah.
do want to
I was
ask
just
you
going to
about
say,
SBS.
these aren't international schools. These are just normal suburban primary
Yeah.
schools.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
got it. Hmm. But I did want to ask you about SBS because
Yeah.
SBS is a television chat. Well, it's radio stations as well, right?
Correct.
But it's a very specific Australian thing, and that's, I believe, the channel that used to air the Eurovision Song Contest. I don't know if it still does. There was, I mean, could you maybe tell us a bit more
Yes.
about
So
SBS?
SBS Special Broadcasting Service was very much the multicultural, and still is very much the multicultural world. And I think their campaign is 7 billion stories and counting, or something, to do with the
Hmm.
world's population. So it's when it first came out, it was very much I'm not going to say a novelty, but it was introducing us to something we hadn't had. So, world movies on SBS. This is
Yes.
where you would get access. There's news. You can watch Macedonian news on SBS, or Turkish news on SBS. So it was very much the multi-language, and still is, TV station. It's certainly, and it was always very small, SBS. And I think in the early days, you might have had a certain TV antenna to actually pick up SBS. So it was very much,
Right.
one of those smaller TV stations. What I would say is it has certainly grown. It's still, one of the smaller ones. But you do go to SBS. I think you go to SBS for quality. And
Hmm.
SBS has an amazing streaming service, SBS On Demand, and then they have SBS Viceland. But it
Where you
and
would
they
get
have
a lot of French. I remember seeing some French films and some
absolutely.
French series.
Yes. And I think we also grew up, and this is a very sheltered Australian outlook that I'm going to reference, that, you know, European movies were a little racy. Well, it was
Right.
the European movies we were being shown on SBS that, you know,
That's right.
were perhaps a little bit more liberated than sort of buttoned up Australia in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then SBS has a you know, multitude of specific language channels, and SBS French being a big one. And SBS is where the Tour de France is aired, and Eurovision. So absolutely. But SBS has really come into its own with the streaming services, and there's a lot you can access through there.
And I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I wish I find it more frustrating sometimes now that you have to kind of dig up some stuff to actually watch. I mean, we spoke about Deadlock, is it?
Yes.
The television series, which is the kind of the latest.
Set in Tasmania. Yes.
That's right. And that's the latest Australian program that I've seen, you know, in recent months. And I'd forgotten, I mean, we can have our opinions about Deadlock, but I had forgotten
opinions about Deadlock.
but no, but there's always an added soul, I find. I mean, there's an Australian way of doing these shows, and layering humor with drama, with tension. I think it is a very specific kind of set of skills, which I remember seeing. I mean, I remember seeing Love, and these were all DVD sets that were sent to me. Some of them you sent, some of them other friends sent. But if you think about Offspring and Love My Way,
yes.
and I'm trying to think of more, but you know, A Secret Life of Us, all of those shows, they have such a specific way of going about telling stories, and The Slap, the television series, The Slap, which was adapted from the book. I find there was something I always found that there was something very special. Was it me being more invested in them knowing they were Australian? I don't think so. I think there really was an added layer in there.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because in the 80s, and I remember I studied this at uni, and it was all to do with a tax law changing that actually resulted in a lot of miniseries. Australia was really good in the 70s, 80s, and maybe early 90s in creating really good miniseries. So, you know, like Return to Eden, Bodyline, which was about the Bodyline cricket series, The Shirley, you know, a whole range of really good quality drama miniseries, which we don't have. I'm trying to think of the last good miniseries like that. And I'm talking like, you know, All the Rivers Run, you know, a whole range, but they were like 3 or 4 parters. Then we've had this sort of purple period of these Secret Life of Us. And I think it was also representing, you know, the miniseries that we had were always, on the whole, were historical.
Yes.
Whereas these were very much every day. I mean, The Secret Life of Us was filmed in St Kilda, so it seemed very accessible. It seemed like we could live that life of those people in The Secret Life of Us. And I was just
as did for us. Go ahead. I'll say it after.
One thing I loved about The Secret Life of, I mean, there's a lot I loved about The Secret Life of Us, but one thing to me that stood out, I think it was one of the first times, if not the first time, that a First Nations person played a character where there was absolutely zero reference to the fact that they were Indigenous.
Right.
They were just a cast member, which I absolutely love. So that was Deborah Mailman playing that character. There was no big deal made out of it in the show, you know, and that felt like we were making progress a little bit in how we saw different parts of Australia.
There was something very relatable about that. And there was something very relatable, interestingly, for France about Heartbreak High. So Heartbreak High was a massive, massive hit at the end of the 90s. but not all of the seasons, but mostly the seasons where you had Anita and was it Drazik that he was
yes.
called? Yes. So those seasons were huge. You know what? We would actually run home from I was already at university and there, but I just want to talk about the multicultural factor because if you think about Saved by the Bell or Beverly Hills 90210, these were American series that we were exposed to that had no relatability factor. It was just a group of white people with no, well, not Saved by the Bell, Lark Voorhees, Lisa Turtle, no, but I loved that Heartbreak High had Lebanese people and people from Eastern Europe and Greek people, and I wanted to reference Ada Nicodemu.
Yes.
So although there weren't the same communities that we had that we had in France, they were still Mediterranean communities, and there was more of an identification possibility. And there was so little Asian representation back in the day. So when they brought in Asian actors to portray characters on the show, I went to a very multicultural school. One of my best friends was from Vietnam. So we really kind of loved the concept of Heartbreak High, which was, absolutely loved it.
Yes, and I will admit I wasn't. I was Heartbreak High, Heartbreak Kid, I think it was called.
Yeah, but we didn't get those. We only got
exactly, yes. So I did watch the series. Perhaps I was not as much, but I have always known how much you liked the series and how much it resonated. And I was thinking the other day that the equivalent to us of you getting Heartbreak High was Australians getting Degrassi Junior High from Canada.
We got it too.
So we were, it was a break. Not that we didn't get a lot of Nickelodeon or Mickey Mouse Club things here, but we did get, Growing Pains and Who's the Boss, which we talked about in the previous one. From England, we got the Press Gang, and I'm trying to think of, a few of the other shows. But Degrassi Junior High for us felt far more relatable with the different types of characters. And
I agree with you because,
I remember one episode where Wheels came in at the time Footscray, which is now the Bulldogs, Footscray Football Club AFL or VFL jumper, it would have been at the time. And we were like, oh my God, what's he doing wearing?
How did that happen?
I know. So when I was thinking about how much Heartbreak High resonated, for us it was Degrassi Junior High from Canada. And I think we've always related with Canada more than America culturally.
It was a big hit in France as well. And what I loved about Degrassi, certainly the early seasons, was that the characters were so unpolished.
Yes.
In 90210 or Saved by the Bell, everyone was hot. Everyone was wearing cool designer clothes. Everything was so polished.
Yes.
Degrassi was raw, kind of unfiltered, and it was such a breath of kind of fresh air of seeing characters on TV that were, kind of you and the people that you went to school with.
Exactly. And I know we're going to topic, but off topic here, but and the stories in Degrassi, I remember, was it Spike with the big, Spike with
the
spiky
hair,
hair.
Pregnancy and the abortion stuff.
Pregnancy, yes, and her friend Liz. And I remember one of them had a medical condition. The other one was very strong animal liberationist. And it was I'm not going to say in the time, it still happens, but there was a heightened thing on testing on animals. And one of the characters, I think, either protested or released the animals that were being tested on. And her friend said, but I've got a medical condition that needs these medical research. And I thought the way they tackled those kind of issues for teen kids was so, out there. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because to us, Heartbreak High, I think because we have such a strong Mediterranean community in Australia, you sort of forget then how much that would actually resonate in the Mediterranean to see those communities
It did.
represented on
And
TV.
yeah, so I mean, and then you never know what's going to work or what. I mean, for a long time, Heartbreak High aired in France without ever going anywhere, and then all of a sudden it just picked up with kind of like the right storylines,
Yes.
and it was really, and it was. I mean, I have very fond memories of that. The producers are telling me that maybe we should have done one episode about France and one episode about Australia.
I feel, and my producers are telling us we've got a little bit of added time. They've told me that we've got an extra 15 minutes. So
Okay, beautiful. Thank you.
not that we want to use up.
Why are they telling us different things? They're telling you some things, and
Our producers need to talk to each other a bit better. But yeah, I mean, I know, because I feel like I've just completely raced through things. But it's sort of going back to the streaming services and probably SBS, because SBS has introduced us to more shows. But things like Call My Agent, The Bureau.
yes, which is getting an American version,
Well, we're
produced
going to do an episode on bad cultural remakes.
Yeah, Eva Longoria is producing that one. Let's see how we go.
Your good friend. Lupin.
Yes.
And then one that, so this is another interesting one, isn't it? Because about cultural references is that my partner discovered Balthazar.
Yes,
Which
yes,
we
Balthazar.
absolutely fell in love with. Oh my gosh. I mean, he wants to be him, I want to date him. Like, but then you could give me the context of the actors and the background of the actors in Balthazar, because I'm only seeing them in the context of them in the show.
Yes.
But then you could actually tell me more about them, and their careers before they came into the show.
You mean now or
yes, yeah.
after?
No,
not
now. But you were informing me and giving me.
I could actually, yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
so
it was a huge
interesting for us to watch it in the moment of time that it's this series Balthazar. But then I guess, like me filling you in on Kylie Minogue before Neighbours, you could fill me in on their careers before now. Not now. I'm
no.
my God.
Yes.
My producer is telling me to be a little bit more succinct.
No, but you know what? Going back to Kylie Minogue and you filling me in, I remember seeing an interview of Danny Minogue on French television, and they did, they kind of did. I sometimes feel how often Danny gets asked about Kylie, and they did an interview which was for once quite fun, which was, who did it first? So they asked her a lot of questions, and one of the questions was, who was famous first? And Danny Minogue said, me.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
And she said, yeah, so absolutely. So that was that was interesting. That was interesting to see.
I can remember the episode where Kylie went on Young Talent Time, and I mean, we were still talking about Danny Minogue's sister.
Yeah, is that the sisters are doing it for themselves episode?
In the silver glittery dresses. So Danny Minogue for sure was far more famous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that's the segue into our next item, which is Danny Minogue's Young Talent Time older sister, Tina Arena.
Lucky we've left a bit of time for this.
That's right. But
before we go into her, I just want to, in case I forget, it wouldn't be an episode about France in Australian pop culture if I did, and talking about music, if I didn't reference Ça Plane Pour Moi by Plastic Bertrand, which of course he's Belgium anyway. So Belgian. So, but we always assume it's French. So that was a big moment in our music industry with Ça Plane Pour Moi.
And I have to say something about the French Film Festival in Australia. When I was at uni in Sydney in 2000, and I mean the power of a film and sitting and French films are very often, as well as Australian films, very much about conveying an atmosphere. And I remember going to the French Film Festival, and not only was it the films that were being played, but also the atmosphere of the festival itself, which I have such fond memories of, finding that little window into my culture and being exposed to aspects of my own culture that not necessarily knew about.
Yes.
And there was something, I am so glad that these festivals exist and that they're being, still being supported and they're still growing. I think it's really great.
Absolutely. And we've just had the 35th French Film Festival, or Alliance Francaise French Film Festival. Once again, amazing. And then, a year later, these films come out in mainstream release.
That's right.
And it's one of the largest French film festival, one of the last, oh gosh, put my teeth back in, one of the largest French film festivals outside of France. So it's one of the largest in the world, the Australian French Film Festival. So
I still have the poster from the 2001, which is Vanessa Paradis. So yeah, The Girl on the Bridge was the film that she was in that year.
Well, and of course, her ex-husband Johnny Depp featured in one of the French Film Festival films this year. His first French-speaking role.
See, full circle.
Full circle. Tina Arena.
All right. Tina Arena. We cannot not talk about Tina Arena if we're going to talk about Down Under and the French Connection. Interestingly, I mean, I'm just going to, I'll put $20 in the jar. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, anyone who knows me knows my passion for Tina Arena. And I have to say, for me, I knew Tina Arena before she started becoming popular in France. Chains was released in France. It was not a hit, but it was released in France. And then came I Want to Spend My Lifetime Loving You, which was from the Mask of Zorro soundtrack. But Tina Arena, so the story of Tina Arena becoming singing in French actually came from a songwriter seeing her perform in English on French television and being inspired to write a song for her. So she's spoken about this, and when she heard the demo for the first time, she wasn't impressed with the song. Aller plus haut, which was her first French song, came out in the summer of 1999, and it became the 10th biggest selling song of the year in France. And I'm talking about when CD singles still moved millions of copies if they made it to number one. So it peaked at number two, and the rest is history. I think France has always had this tradition of being very sensitive to artists making the effort to cross over into performing in French. And talk about a crossover. That's the one aspect of a crossover that we haven't spoken about is, singing in different languages. So Tina Arena doing that, I think, really created a fondness for her beyond the beauty of her voice, which no one can take away from her. And I think that it was a very big kind of period where, powerful voices were all the rage. If you think about Mariah, Whitney, Celine, and then Tina Arena, you kind of fit right in. And the fact that she decided to sing in French kind of put her on the map even more. And
so I've always been interested in, because she's got Italian heritage.
Yes.
I've always been very interested in an Australian Italian person making the crossover into French music. Did she ever try? Was it ever a thing? And I mean, I know, you've talked about how big the French music scene is. I don't know how big the Italian music scene is. I would say not nearly as big. But has she ever talked about, or has she ever wanted to make inroads into the Italian music scene?
I mean, we'd have to have that conversation when she, comes on the podcast. I mean, she's in Melbourne. You find her. I mean, I'm no good here, but
she might pop up over there, I'm sure, soon.
Look, she's performed a few songs in Italian, but I think Tina Arena has always been a free spirit, and I mean, rightfully so, and has always gone where her heart's taken her. She certainly has performed some songs in Italian, and she's released Italian versions of her own songs. There's an Italian version of Burn, for example. She's performed with Bocelli. But it's true that she's never actually released a full album of songs in Italian. And I remember hearing her. We have a very popular singer in France called Florent Pagny, who released his version of Caruso, the very popular song by Lucio Dalla. And she actually did a duet with him of that song. And it kind of blew my mind that she actually, when hearing that, never had released an album of Italian songs. But there's so many things I wish Tina Arena had released that she never did. So
Okay, she's still alive.
yeah, no, I know. But like I said, she just, she does her own thing, which I think is great. And her latest album, Love Saves, is amazing. But
And of course, we should, we've been talking about Young Talent Time. And for those listening who don't know, Tina Arena started off on Young Talent Time with Danny Minogue, but she was known as Tiny Tina Arena. And so we should give her credit for that.
No.
What do you think? Oh.
No, but I wanted to talk about her legacy, but maybe your question ties in with that.
Yes, my question is, why has Tina Arena resonated so much in France? And I remember you telling me that you'd been to a bar, might have been a piano bar, and you said, and there was a Tina Arena sing-along. And
that's the one I was going to reference now.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what is it about Tina Arena that has made her almost a cult figure in France.
I think Tina Arena,
parts of the French community.
I think she wanted a fresh start. I think she was very open about the fact that at one point in her life, she wanted a kind of a fresh start, and France gave her that opportunity. And that was the time when variety music shows were all over primetime television. So I think that Tina Arena may well have been between 2000, 2001, and 2, maybe, one of the artists that appeared on the most primetime variety shows, performing songs, and it was all the rage to have duets. And also, I have to say, there was it was the time for big voices to shine.
Yes.
And so I think there was a lot of luck involved as well, because the musical Notre Dame de Paris was one of the biggest hits at the turn of the century in France, and they were looking for the right person to portray Esmeralda in the English version. And she happened to be performing at one of the shows where the guy who had written the musical was also appearing. And so I think there were a lot of moments like that. I think she also performed at the opening ceremony of the Sydney Olympics. And just the songs were good. They were catchy. She covered Edith Piaf. The songs were good and they were catchy. And I think she made I don't know how much of those decisions were hers and only hers, but I think that a lot of the right moves were made along the way. And then she released another album in 2005 called Un autre univers, and it was just as big a hit. And it was her first full-length studio album in French. And it was she has a song called Je m'appelle Bagdad, which she actually performs in Australia as well, which is, those songs, Aller plus haut, aimer jusqu'à l'impossible, Aller plus haut particularly, they've become French variety kind of standards. And that bar thing, I was in a bar in my hometown, Clermont-Ferrand, which I am in today, and we went for a pub quiz. And while they took all the papers back with all the answers, and as they were kind of grading the papers, they started to play some songs, and they put Tina Arena Aller plus haut on. And it was people who were like maybe 3 years old when that song came out, or 5 years old. And everyone in the bar, which was jam-packed, just started singing along to the song. And that's when I realized the power of a good song, a legacy song that kind of stands the test of time. And I mean, what a great achievement. She's been knighted by the president. She really has, we have a soft spot for, it happens to be women most times who actually come to France and spend some time and sing in the language. And we have had many along the way. And one of the biggest ones was Tina Arena. And she performed when Cadel Evans won the Tour de France. She actually phoned France Television and said, you can't play a tape or a CD for the anthem. I'm coming down. Well,
look, I remember when that happened, 2011, when Cadel Evans. So that's a nice little full circle with us all being big fans of the Tour de France. But it always seemed so foreign that an Australian would win a Tour de France, you know. So, I mean, that was the whole of Australia was watching. But I do remember when she went down to sing the anthem, and I remember a cousin of mine saying, of course she did. She wasn't going to miss this moment to get her head on TV. So you do have the cynics who look at it very much as she knew the good PR she would get. But it was superb. I mean, she was just in her Australian T-shirt, you know, with the flag on.
She said she spoke about it and she wrote about it in her autobiography, Now I Can Dance. She actually, it was, I mean, you have to know the right person to call at the right time. Because, you know, absolutely. So from what she says in the book, it could have not happened. It could also not have happened the way it did.
It was perfect. You know, it was absolutely perfect.
No, absolutely.
And I think Australia does it. Australia has a habit of not recognizing, not realizing. We don't always give, perhaps we take for granted sometimes how big our stars are when they go overseas. I mean, Keith Urban is a classic one. We didn't really realize how big he was in America until he'd made it. We know Tina Arena and her French songs, and we know she's big, but I still don't think Australia fully realize how big and popular she has been and successful she has been in France. And you talked earlier about how Australia seems so remote. We feel remote. I mean, whenever we fly anywhere, I mean, I wouldn't live anywhere else. Absolutely love Australia. But we do feel we are at the and we're not, you know, there's a lot of people in the Southern Hemisphere. Not everyone is in the North. You know, we are close to Asia, but still even to certain parts of Asia, for someone in Melbourne, everything's a flight. It's a long flight. So we do feel quite remote. And I think that flows over into sometimes not seeing how big people are. And, you know, In Excess, we knew In Excess and AC/DC, you know, were big internationally, Olivia Newton-John. But I would never have known until we did this episode and we're talking about it in the lead up that Midnight Oil was, I mean, I knew Midnight Oil was the big here, but I've never quite fully realized how big they are internationally. So while we feel remote, and I think we also put a remote lens on things as well and kind of bump it down. Sunburned country of ours.
But I think sometimes to understand the magnitude of things, sometimes you have to take a step back and assess. I think for Tina Arena, people don't, I mean, we've spoken about this, but so many of her songs have been covered by prominent country artists in the United States. She's had #1 dance hits around the world. She's performed classical music with Andrea Bocelli and, you know, she's performed with Zucchero in Italy in Italian. So she's ticked a lot of boxes, and yet I still feel sometimes that she's underrated. She was inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame. She has a lot of opinions, and I also love her for that. So I like that she's an all-round kind of artist in the noble sense, of the term. So, I mean, I'm glad, you know what, of all the artists that we could have gotten from Australia, I think we got a really good one to cross over and kind of give us everything that she gave us for so many years.
Absolutely. And you referenced Edith Piaf, and I mean, I completely remiss of me to have not, you know, we grew up knowing Edith Piaf. We didn't know a lot about her, certainly since, you know, films have come out, we've known more. We certainly know her iconic songs, that sound. So I feel like, sort of in wrapping up, a lot of the references we've had to France, I would say pre-streaming services, because we certainly get a lot more reference, is more historical references, you know, not current pop culture things, unless it's, as I said, seen through an American or an English eye. Yes.
No, I just wanted to reference an item in the news that I don't know if you'll remember from the early 90s is, and it's not a good one, but it's media. And it was probably one of the biggest stories that kind of tied in Australia with France. I mean, there's been a few along the way. I think
You're not
Macron
talking about the submarines, are you?
I'm talking about the nuclear testing in the Pacific.
Oh, yes.
So nuclear testing in the Pacific. I'm talking about the didn't Macron, I don't remember which prime minister it was, but he called his wife delicious. Your delicious wife. Do you remember this?
No, I don't.
He wanted to say delightful, I'm assuming, and he ended up calling his wife like really while giving a speech
it
at
does
the
ring a bell.
lectern.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, while giving a speech at the lectern. And then, I mean, because we're talking about news and that's our point of view as well, but a big story in France for us was the fact that the two guys that tried to confront the killer at the Bondi Junction, tragedy were French, two Frenchmen. So,
do you know what the French community in Australia, the French expat community in Australia is very small. It's very strong, and I certainly work with the French community, but it is a small community. But when absolutely with the Bondi Westfield stabbings, but when the AUKUS submarine fiasco came out a couple of years ago, where Australia had an agreement with France, and then our Prime Minister and certain people at the time just did the dirty and then created this AUKUS agreement with the UK and America. Amongst my friends, and I'm not talking about my French friends, I'm talking about my Australian friends. I mean, I don't know about submarines. I have never been interested in submarines, but we were so angry that who we felt, and France has always been, we haven't touched on it enough, of France and Australia have always been allies, and particularly in those world wars that we fought in. So there's a very strong connection between Australia and France because of that ally. But we were so angry with what we had done to who we perceived as our good friends. And I was talking to someone who works in a French association about this, and they said they had Australians ringing them saying, "We're so sorry."
Yeah.
We didn't have any control in it, obviously, but we really felt like we had done the dirty on an ally of ours. And certainly
that's hard power, though. It's not soft power.
Yes. But you're right about the nuclear testing. I mean, that was a big thing. And certainly we do have in the Pacific close neighbours, and there's certainly situations which we're not going to touch on now, but there's certainly some volatile situations and ongoing situations in some of those Pacific countries in the moment to do with a constitutional change with France. So it is ever present that we do have these local French neighbours as well.
Yes.
But that ally element is a really big thing. And as I said, because, so many Australians fought and died in those two world wars, and so many are buried in those particular French towns, that's never lost on us. And certainly when we have things like Anzac Day, which is our sort of Memorial Day, there's always memorials in, those areas in France.
Yeah, I mean, a very quick anecdote. I remember reaching out to the Australian ambassador in France a few years ago because one of my friend's mother had been part of the project in Canberra of all those ladies and men, I'm assuming, knitting the poppies.
Yes.
And so we had spoken about it over Christmas in 2017. And I reached out to the ambassador because I'm part of the France Australia Alumni Network because I went to university in Sydney. And I actually, one of the poppies was sent to him from Canberra, and he wore it.
Yes.
And he wore it. So these are good connections. And also the ship that goes to Antarctica, the French mission ship that goes to Antarctica is in Hobart when it's not going around.
Yes.
One of my favorite places in the world, Hobart, Tasmania. You concur?
I concur, yes.
Great.
Well, I'm getting the wind up from our producers.
Yes.
So we really could have done this over about 4 episodes, but
I know, right?
And I'm sure it's flowed into our other episodes, and it will continue flowing into our other episodes,
As has
regardless
every
of the
other
topic.
topic we've talked about.
Exactly. But before we go into a quick pop culture moment, you are I was remiss in not mentioning Sa Plum Pour One and Edith Piaf, but you are very remiss in not mentioning Round the Twist. And you and I are going to Aries Inlet for a little mini break and walking up to the lighthouse, the Split Point Lighthouse, which of course is featuring Round the Twist. And I remember you talking about watching Round the Twist and inspiring you to come to Australia. And you didn't even mention it in this podcast.
No, and I apologize. I had it on some list, but it must have been the wrong one that I was looking at. Yes, I remember Round the Twist because it used to air at around 5:30 p.m. in the evening, and it was such a specific, again, we were talking about atmospheres, and it conveyed such a specific atmosphere. And I remember, was there that episode where all of these seagulls just
I'm going to admit I've never watched an episode.
Oh, you haven't?
I think I was like maybe 1 or 2 years too old for it. And when you're a child,
I remember the song.
The difference between 6 or 8, or
Yeah.
So, but having been to Aries Inlet a lot, and we do have a photo which we will pop on our Instagram.
Yes,
of Vicken
absolutely.
at the said lighthouse.
We should. And there was a picture of Tina Arena's been there because I've seen a picture on the socials. Same spot.
Wow. We've got 4 minutes. So I don't have much of a pop culture moment this week, but I know you've got a very big one.
I do, and I'm going to try and
pop culture minutes to you to talk
Thank you
about
so
your
much.
Big pop culture moment.
So I was in the United Kingdom a few days ago, and I went to see Girls Aloud in concert. And I've been a fan of Girls Aloud for 20 years, since they came out on Popstars The Rival in the United Kingdom, second season of Popstars. So 2 bands were put together, and they were competing for the coveted #1 Christmas song. So Girls Aloud went to #1, and I'd been wanting to see them for 20 years. What a glorious concert it was. I went to Cardiff, which was the smallest venue of the tour. So there was kind of like an added value to being so close. And look, what's fascinating about Girls Aloud is that for a girl band, they really went from strength to strength. It wasn't like they had one big album and everything after that was, less. Their biggest selling album was their 5th album, their last studio album. So, I mean, there's something to be said about longevity and legacy. They've always been a big touring act. They've toured almost every album they've released. And unfortunately, one of their members passed away from breast cancer in 2021. So there was this idea of, are they ever coming back together? They came back together, put together a glorious celebration of their music, but also a glorious celebration of Sarah, who passed away in 2021. Hit after hit after hit after hit. The level of interaction, they were individually brilliant, every single one of them. The level of interaction between themselves was so heartwarming. We've been talking about feuds and pitting women against each other. It was always an ongoing story of who in the band doesn't get along with who else.
Yes.
And seeing them being touchy-feely with each other, getting emotional, nailing the dance, nailing the vocals, because, girl band on a TV show, what is expected of them vocally?
Yes.
They were absolutely incredible. The hair tosses, I mean, everything was just absolutely glorious. And the way in which they paid tribute to, I have to mention them all, Cheryl, Kimberly, Nadine, and Nicola. The way they paid tribute to Sarah was just, I had ideas and was wondering what it was going to be. It was absolutely incredible. I'm going to add some Girls Aloud songs to the Australia Friends playlist.
Please do, because is this the point where I tell you I don't think I would know one Girls Aloud song?
Well, you might have heard Sound of the Underground, but you know what? You don't sustain a 20-year career if you haven't got the goods to back it up.
Yes.
And the show was just absolutely beautiful. And music does bring people together. A lot is being said about Swifties, but I met some people there. We went to the show together. We messaged each other after. We're planning on staying friends.
Perfect. Love it.
Love it. So Girls Aloud, well done. And the tour is far from over. So if you're listening from anywhere else that you can go and get a ticket, please do. They're still performing all around the UK for a month.
It doesn't need to be Taylor in Lyon. It can be Girls Aloud in Cardiff.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
In France.
Well, thank you, Georgie. Stacey's in Sydney, Australia.
Sydney.
Yeah.
It's been great. We have raced through cultural influences, but I'm very excited about our next episode, which we won't reveal just yet, but I'm sure we will have more cultural references in there and crossover. And I should mention that I'm wearing I'm wearing really a Down Under French Connection item, because I'm wearing a wind cheater that is a collaboration between Laura Brown, the Australian fashion editor, and Cezanne. Is that
yes?
Yes.
Cezanne,
which is a wind cheater, which I will stand up, which is French enough.
Love it.
So you couldn't have a more appropriate French-Australian collaboration to wear.
Well, I'm wearing a Girls Aloud t-shirt.
Perfect. See, what more can you
But I want to say, let this show be my declaration of love for Australia. It was a dream of mine to live, work, study there, and I've done all three and made lifelong friends along the way. Most importantly, you. So there you have it.
Thank you. And ditto. And I think meeting you even enhanced my love of the French community. And of course, I work very closely with them on an event, the Bastille Day French Festival in Australia, and have made lifelong French friends, and have been welcomed into the French expat community in Australia, or in Melbourne, with such open and warm arms that it is one of the most amazing communities that I've worked with. And I am very much the Francophile, but it's and I wrote a little thing on LinkedIn about it, that it have to be welcomed into this community has been amazing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Until next time.
See you.
Bye.
This has been Drop It Like It's Pop.
Be sure to follow us on our Instagram page at Drop Like It's Pop to have access to our latest episodes and playlists.
Until next time.